Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Christoph, and everyone. Excited to be starting the Lunchtime Colloquium for this session. And I want to say that Christoph has done more than half of my job here. Yes, so I would just make conversation and go on, because what I want to say, I've been doing, I think you understand it. And I'm sure today's presentation is just an extension of the one I did at the After Crisis of workshop we had in July, and where I was talking about beyond an ethical perspective for environmental philosophy. But today, which is part of the project I'm doing here, and today we'll be discussing complementary epistemology, a viable framework for environmental philosophy. And we'll start this discussion by looking at a question raised by Bunyan Bright. Bright is a professor emeritus of environmental justice at the School for Environmental and Sustainability, University of Michigan. And he asked this question: that is it environmental crisis we're having, or crisis of epistemology? And because, and his case, his argument is that isn't the case that how we know the world and how we choose to do, or what we choose to do with what we know of the world, is the fundamental crisis, fundamental cause of environmental crisis. And in answering that question, I think that question is important to the discussion of today, and this particular time in the history of environmentalism, because if we begin to consider that this year is the 60th year of Rachel Carson's outburst against the ills against the environment in our time. And you want to agree with me that things hasn't changed than it was in our time, because we have more, we are experiencing more degradation of the environment even in our days now. And we still need to begin to ask the right question. Is it environmental crisis we are having, or we are having crisis of epistemology? What is the foundation for all these anthropogenic causes of environmental crisis we are having? Is it just scientific postulation? Is it technological innovation? Is it just economic ideas? Or there are some things underneath that is bringing these things up? And that is what we are talking together. It is the crisis of epistemology. And I want to quickly look at, well, we know what the problems are, series of environmental challenges we're having in the world, and they seem unabated. In fact, presently in Nigeria, we're having a crisis of flood. About 6 states out of the 36 states of the country is submerged underwater, and the burial ground is being washed, the dead bodies are being washed out. You can imagine the health implication of all that. And we want to continue to see, is this a cause of just science alone, or there's some other thing we can begin to look at, or some other question we need to begin to ask. And so quickly, we'll be looking at the epistemic dogma of subject-object dichotomy, and how that epistemic dogma is the cause, is the foundation, basis for the anthropogenic causes of environmental crisis. In other words, this anthropogenic environmental degradation that are ravaging the world today, they are consequences of the epistemic process that detaches the epistemic subject from the epistemic object. Please, I'm coming from philosophy, and when I'm talking about epistemic subject, I mean the one that is making the knowledge claim. And the epistemic object is what the knowledge claim is about. And how does that affect science? How does that affect technological innovations? How does that affect science, economics? We'll look at it together now. The epistemic dogma, that there is a distinction between the subject and object is the intellectual framework for understanding of nature as that which is apart or detached from the humans. In other words, the external world will be seen as that which is less or not significant in the epistemological process. The epistemological process is the process of knowing, of claiming to know something, of having accusation of knowledge, or justifying your knowledge claim. The scientific knowledge claim you are making, how do you justify it? How do you even know that the scientific claim you are saying, they are appropriate? The account of knowledge, we are saying that the account of knowledge is articulated in a manner that places knowledge in a place that is far removed from the physical entities and everyday activities of the human life. So, as noted by Christopher Preston, that what is needed for knowledge in the Western traditional intellectual thought is to disengage from everything about us that is human and physical, and we make use of reason, which is a gift from the gods, as a conduit back to upward truth located somewhere else entirely. And I'm sure some of us know Preston here is talking about the Platonic idea of the world of the forms, where the tangible thing exists, and the world of the physical for him is the imagination of what you have in the world of the form. And it's saying that if you want to know from the Platonic perspective now, you have to abstract your mind to the world of the form to grasp the reality there. If you don't do that, then you cannot have knowledge. And so this Platonic idea of knowledge accusation or knowledge process presented a state of detachment between the epistemic subject and the epistemic object of the external world. With true knowledge residing in the forms, Plato makes knowledge accusation a pure subject-oriented function without consideration for the physical world. And if you want to say, that is Platonic, the modernists came up with some other worldview about epistemology that could be functional for environmentalism. We'll look at it and we'll discover that what the modernists did was to replace Plato's idea of form, Plato's form with idea. And they continue with privileging the idea over the physical world. For them, the rationalists will claim that just have reason and the act of the mind. With that alone, you can process what you want to know. You do not need the external world to make knowledge claim. And the empiricists will say that, the grasping of the idea through sense experience is the source of knowledge. Once you can grasp the idea you want through your sense experiences, then you have knowledge claim. Either way, we will see that the mind or the subject or the person making reason still plays a sole and privileged role in the acquisition of knowledge over the external world. And what is the implication of this for science, for instance? We find out that the history of scientific development from the modernist period up to the Enlightenment is built upon this epistemic framework of detachment between the subject and the object. And if, for instance, you want to look at Francis Bacon's Novum Organum, for him he was saying that man is the minister and interpreter of nature, and man does and understands only as much as is observed the order of nature. For him, nature is conquered only by obedience of man to the principles of science. So nature is nothing but that which you have to conquer. And those are the foundation and a basis upon which scientific postulation comes to build on. Then I think we don't need to wonder so much while we continue to have crisis despite the affluence of technological innovation we're having today, because this technological process, the economic projections that are driving this technological process, they are all informed by this epistemic ideology. then we now begin to see that this epistemic dogma of subject-object enhances the anthropocentric and the mechanistic mode of thinking that informs the frontier mentality. Let me quickly run you through this. I said earlier on that my talk is from the field of philosophy, and in philosophy, many of you, I'm sure you are aware of, you've heard so much of environmental ethics. It's talking about the philosophic orientation in environmentalism. And the philosophic orientation in environmentalism is often canonized or categorized under environmental ethics. But for me, my research work is saying that that is wrong. What we have is environmental philosophy, which is a type of an applied form of philosophy. In other words, it entails interrogating the concern of philosophy for environmental crisis. How do you use the tools of philosophy to discuss the challenges of environmental crisis? And Zimmerman and Callicott has done a good work in giving us three types of three sections in which environmental philosophy is categorized into. One is called radical eco-philosophy, anthropocentric reformism, and environmental ethics. But unfortunately today you find environmental ethics being what is taking over, which everyone is engaging with, or taking over all this other discourse. But despite that, we have series of other colleagues, scholars that have been arguing for beyond the ethical perspective. And one of such is Ananias and folks. They've advocated for a psychological or phenomenological approach to dealing with environmental crisis. We have the likes of Freya Matthews. Freya Matthews is an Australian. I think she's retired now, and she's arguing for the metaphysical approach. And we have, for instance, Mark Collivan is saying that the necessity and argue for necessity and non-sufficiency of ethics in environmental philosophy. And we've had a lot of other scholars that have argued for the epistemic approach, epistemological approach, like Chenen and Whiston, Gordon, Preston, Scarf, Oyekunle, Bryant, and lots of persons. But the question we begin to ask ourselves from the story we've heard about what epistemology could do, and how is the basis for the anthropogenic cause of environmental crisis? Should we not throw epistemology away? Is it that epistemology is not important? I'm saying no, because epistemology informs our pedagogy, our scientific inquiry, our truth, and by implication, it informs our ethics. In fact, epistemology provides the foundation for a culture's worldview which determines the mental construct that the people use in understanding reality. And that takes me back to the question raised by Bryant earlier on in this discussion, saying that is it the crisis of environmental crisis we're having or epistemology crisis? Because if epistemology provides the foundation for a culture's worldview and is the basis for the mental construct with which we understand reality, the mental construct with which we understand nature, then how I see nature, how I know nature determines what I choose to do with nature. And if I know nature to have been detached from me, then that means I will treat nature as that which is not part of me. The scientific postulation I will make about nature will be without considering the environmental health of nature itself, without considering the environmental health of the others outside me, because knowledge claim is based on the subject. And so, if we are not throwing away epistemology, what do we need to do to make epistemology a viable framework for environmental philosophy? And that is the basis of my, we've discussed is the epistemic foundation for environmental crisis, the true knowledge detached from the physical world. We've talked about all this, and all this is saying that it's giving the detachment enhances frontier mentality. But now, to what do we do with epistemology to make it functional? And from the Western perspective, I come up with what I call enlightened externalism. Enlightened externalism is a fusion of internalism and externalism. Internalism and externalism are just two opposing views of theory of epistemic justification. In other words, when you make a knowledge claim, how do you justify the knowledge claim you are making? And for the internalist, they will say that, no, just base the knowledge claim on the viability of the cognitive grasp of the knower. And that the cognitive grasp of the knower is placed important over and above the external world. And for the externalist, they will say, no, the truth of the knowledge claim depends on condition, on future outside the knower. See, two different views outside there. But I'm saying these two views, they are important to achieving truth of knowledge claim. But on their own, they are good, but individually, they are fine, but they are exclusive. One is exclusive of the other. But if you can have a fusion of the two, you have what you call an enlightened externalism. Enlightened externalism is a term that I employ to explicate the idea of an internalist that permits some externalist constraint in the enterprise of knowledge justification in order to have a holistic framework towards achieving the epistemic goal of truth maximization. In other words, the epistemic subject and the epistemic object, they become two sides of a coin that complement each other in knowledge justification and accusation. And that is the complementary epistemology that I'm talking of. The complementary epistemology in which the subject is not just important alone, or the object outside there, the external world outside there is not important to give knowledge, but both must complement each other to give justification, to give knowledge claim. And I'm saying that this kind of epistemic framework from the Western perspective is important because at the intersection of both, at the fusion of both, the subject-object dichotomy collapses. And by extension, the human nature dichotomy as well collapses. And this fusion places the human essence into an ecological niche. And so we arrive at the position readily adapted for environmental concerns from the Western perspective, because the bias of detachment from nature is removed in the epistemic process. And so I can really know nature. I can know in nature rather than knowing of nature. We will get to that now. And beyond that, so because environmental crisis is a global crisis, and so with the experiences as shown and result from series of environmental solutions profiled, especially in the global south, has shown that because majority of those theories, concepts are Western-based, they having less successes in the global south. And so there is need to have a kind of I don't want to use the word fusion. There is need to have an alternative perspective towards bringing environmental solution by considering indigenous perspective as well. And so I went further to look at the African epistemic process to see in what way can we have an epistemic worldview in the African perspective that is not detaching the subject from the object. And looking at it in the African perspective, true knowledge is to be found in ontological knowledge with full understanding. The intelligence of forces of hierarchy, their cohesion, and interaction. In other words, the ontological process, the ontological idea of knowing, understanding reality in the African perspective is holistic. And it is this ontological idea that informs the epistemic perspective of the Africans. In other words, People like Ramose have argued that the African ontology and epistemology are two aspects of one reality. So you cannot have an epistemic view without the ontological perspective in the African sense. And the ontological perspective there is unitary, where there is a fusion of the epistemic agent. There is the fusion of the epistemic subject and the epistemic object. It's a communitarian system where you cannot say you make a claim of knowledge or know something fully on your own without the external world. And if that is the basis for making reality, for knowing reality there in the African perspective, I think it's as well akin to that of the enlightened externalist perspective as well, where there is a fusion of the subject and the object. And these two, I'm saying each of them standing on its own shows a form of complementary epistemology where the subject and the object, where they are put together as one, where the detachment is obviated, where knowledge now comes down and firmly back to the earth to deal with issues around us. And one beautiful thing about this type of epistemic process is that it makes us to know in nature other than to know of nature. To know of nature is to know about things that is detached from you. But when you know in nature, you are knowing in something that is part of you. And this underscores an enlightenment to respect and have reference to that which is part of you. It brings up a motivation to preserve the environment, and as well, it shows that it is conducive for discourse in environmentalism. And so, complementary epistemology encapsulates the interrelatedness of the epistemic subject and the object. In other words, where to make knowledge claim, the object and the subject have to complement each other. And what does that do for science? What does that do for technological innovations? It obviates the scientific paradigm of disembodiment, decontextualization, or isolation. And I was discussing yesterday with Christoph, and I was telling him the importance of, for instance, an idea that some people will say, no, it's not scientific, for oral tradition. In the farm where we are saying, which is an ecological farm, where everything is produced organic, walking through the farm, you see the import of ideas like this coming into play in the contemporary time. What did I mean by that? If you walk through the farm, there's a section of the farm called the Philosophy Way, where inscriptions that were passed down orally from the grandfather of Carl, generations before his grandfather passed the inscription down to him, were written along the path of the farm. And one of the previous fellow there made a translation of some of those inscriptions. And I found out that what those inscriptions were about is they are all about nature, relationship between nature and human, so that you don't destroy nature. And that informs the kind of agricultural perspective, agricultural approach that is going on in that farm. And that tells you that a framework like this, an epistemic framework that does not detach the nature from humans, that does not detach subject from the object, has an inceptual thinking that enhances sociocultural perspective of human-nature relationship. And so what would be the innovative impact of this kind of epistemic framework? Number one is that it's going to give a robust platform to various intellectual approaches in environmental philosophy, such that you don't just rely on ethics alone, you begin to look at other alternative aspects, alternative framework in dealing with environmental crisis. It engenders nature conservation policies. How will that happen? Because you will now have to be thinking about nature as part of human. You will now begin to think in nature. Whoever that is making those policies will think about, is making policy about himself or herself, or not just about something outside him. Recently, in 2019, Carl Peter Paul was talking about an hydrosocial conception of water. apart from the ideological conception of water. And I was reading through some of the policies about water and hydrological management in Lake Chad Basin in the northern part of Nigeria. And the Lake Chad Basin covered Nigeria and some other part of country in the Western Africa. I was reading through the policy statement, and I found that the policy statement is based on the hydrological conception of water as a natural resources that can just be used and not cared for fully. And that explains the reason why all those policies are not going on well. That explains the reason why the Lake Chad Basin is not well taken care of, and today there is crisis in that region. But if you begin to look at the social conception of water, where you begin to rethink water beyond the definition as natural object, but also as a socio-cultural nexus about water and idea that people that lives within it, which this epistemic framework enhances, we begin to see that it generates a kind of responsibility of care towards nature. And this framework as well can aid interdisciplinary capacity, and it will increase knowledge and foster harmonious relationship. How will it increase knowledge? Presently, we've had series of scholars talking about intercultural idea, especially between the Western and the Asian environmental philosophy. Calicote and Macrae did a good work about Western and Asian approach. But now this is raising the vista of knowledge about the application of epistemology in intercultural discussion in dealing with environmental crisis. So we've said, I don't want to go through the conclusion. We've said all that, and how this framework as well provide background for alternative thinking. And we've shown the potency of this complementary epistemic framework. And I just want to conclude by reading Bryant here. Bryant is saying, if we fail to heed the crisis of epistemology today, we will blunder into the future plagued with a higher level of crime and delinquency, unequalitarian values, unemployment, substandard housing, unhealthy and polluted environment, food shortage, and regional conflict, which may lead to global ones as people migrate across geopolitical boundaries in response to global climate conditions, which is important to tell us that we need to heed the call of the question of crisis of epistemology. I know this might appear as swimming against the tide of known intellectual heritage, but I want to say that for a journey of unlimited miles, it is better to travel hopefully than to arrive. Thank you for listening to me.